So, last time we were talking, we were just kind of leaving off with thinking about some just kind of high-level concepts for what you could do for the actual content, the meat on the bones of your Interp outline. And the assignment was to just take a couple minutes outside of class thinking about what are some things that you could put in that section of the outline, just as kind of broad headings or 5 to 7 or so subheadings, each of which is its own sort of discrete chunk of content. So for non-staffed interpretation, each one of those might be a sign with multiple panels and stuff like that takes about 3 minutes to work through. We talked about the 3-second, 30-second, 3-minute rule, the 333. And today's class is going to pick up right there, and we also want to get into the conclusion section. That's got some pretty specific requirements typically, and that'll kind of set us up for most of the interesting stuff, which is developing all of that content and eventually getting to, try it out on each other, practice this stuff here in class, and on our field trip, see a whole bunch of interpretive content delivered with a variety of techniques. So, with all that, go ahead and pull out your notes, your thoughts on different thematic points. Thematic points, again, is the name for each one of those, or the conceptual name for each one of those, typically 5 to 7 stops along the way, if it's a hike, or 5 to 7 exhibits, all thematically clustered around your overall topic, or what have you. So on staffed interpretation, 1 or 2 of these thematic points, or sort of chunks of content, might be something like a quick game that you could play in 3 to 15 minutes, something like that, right? So for staffed interpretation, we're not as constrained with the 3-minute rule, but that 3 seconds and that 30 seconds, folks are deciding for each chunk of content, am I interested? Is this still worth my time, right? So that meeting that bar, getting over that sort of criteria of or threshold of decision for each of your users or participants is going to get harder as you go, right? So with a good hook, with an interesting and meaningful theme, one that provokes interest and invites engagement and stuff like that, we've got folks for a little while. But after an hour and a half, some folks are starting to think, man, my feet are kind of hurting, or man, I could really use the restroom, maybe again, or what have you. So we want to keep in mind that 3-second quick decision, is this worth my time? And the 30-second evaluation of, okay, what's the case for this being worth my time? Okay, is it unfair that folks make the snap decision, is this worth my time, first before hearing you out on why it should be worth their time? Absolutely. Is that just kind of how brains work? Absolutely. So we don't want to shrink back from that. That gives us an interesting design constraint or challenge. So, with that all said, what are some ideas you have for content in your thematic points section of your outline? And these can be staffed or unstaffed. They can be whatever particular thing that you would like to do. Skill demonstration, living history, a page in a Junior Ranger guide book. Sorry, I didn't mean to spit at you. What kind of ideas are you guys coming up with so far? We've gone through a big list of different options for staffed and unstaffed. What kind of sticks out for you for your topics?
I had a timeline.
A timeline. Okay, cool. So like walking folks through that. We're going backwards.
Like, I don't know, like boards.
Yeah.
Chronological.
Okay. All right. So
Up, like 7 librarians.
sounds good. Planning on going linearly, sequentially through, or kind of skipping around? Yeah, sequentially is more common for that, for sure. For the obvious reason, it's easier to sort of make sense of all this new stuff coming at you when you understand it's part of a narrative or sequence. Cool. Sounds good. We can put a lot into that. We can also use that sequence as the overall list of 5 to 7 thematic points, right? So you could put it into one if it's smaller and you can get through it fairly quickly. Or if you need to give each stop along that timeline a bunch of airtime with your people, then that's entirely okay. That's a very normal way to organize stuff. Anybody else? Might be some interesting thoughts on what to do in the middle of things. Yeah.
So for like the PowerPoint, my PowerPoint idea, just teaching people how to make a good PowerPoint, I would have them like partner up with each other and talk to, like, I would set up an activity about learning each other's learning styles so that they can work on interacting with someone and learning the way that they learn so they can cater that.
Okay, sounds good. The rec program uses a similar facilitation technique with like outdoor games, icebreakers, team building, that kind of stuff, where each person has a chance to think about whatever the prompt or topic or activity is, then get together with one other person, explain your ideas, knock around some ideas with them, hear them out, and then those pair meet with another pair, so 1, 2, 4 up to the whole group. And that gives everybody a fairly non-threatening way to practice what they're thinking about, or at least explain what they're thinking about a couple of times before they have to like roll it out for the bigger group, which can be intimidating, of course, in a larger group setting. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in education, they kind of call that like the I do, you do, we do. So it starts with the presenter demonstrating how to do it, then
Yeah.
you pass it to the audience.
Cool. Right on. A similar technique or a parallel technique, but that doesn't use sort of that group aggregation or agglomeration approach, is called 3 Then Me. So for more of a round table or group discussion, instead of where you are sort of didactically leading folks through and it's one to many, it's instead many to many. You can help set the group sort of expectation that, let at least 3 other people talk before you jump in again. Some folks are chatty pants and other folks not so much. So we want to make sure that, the quieter folks who are still kind of taking things in or deciding if they want to participate or engage, that if they do make that decision to jump in, they're not completely just trampled by folks who are very comfortable and very verbal. Cool. All right, so either one of those can be good depending on what you need to do. So it's totally up to you. You get to choose, as the constructor of all of this, what works well. Cool. Any others? Anybody thinking about a skill demonstration or a game or anything else?
So for paddling, I was thinking a skill demonstration would be like learning different paddling signals, so like holding it up and stop, like waving it around and tell.
Okay.
Teaching people the different signals when they're paddling.
All right, cool. So that can be a fairly straightforward skill demo, kind of a teaching moment. You can often turn teaching moments into games as well. You can imagine how something like a very common game like Simon Says. Has everybody heard of Simon Says? Anybody not heard of it? Okay, yeah. Simon Says, signal for help. Ah, all right, stop. Simon didn't say stop, right? So, or signal stop. So, think about quick and easy and lightweight, fun ways to gamify non-gamey things, just to make them a little bit more interactive and fun. People understand that it's safe and normal and appropriate to participate in games versus just kind of, sit back, arms folded, taking it in. So that's a very friendly way to do that. Let's talk a little bit about gamification for just a second. Gamification is not the same thing as using games. So, we can and want to use both at appropriate moments, or for appropriate thematic points under content. But they're not the same thing. And so we want to make sure that we have a clear distinction of 2 very adjacent concepts, in the same way that outdoor education is not the same thing as environmental education, but they kind of sound and look a little bit alike at times. We want to be very clear on those distinctions so we don't get ourselves confused and therefore leave our participants very confused. So, games are exactly what you think they are, right? So there's all kinds of criteria to game design we can get into a little bit later this semester. I love that part of this class. Gamification is taking elements of games and gameplay and using them in non-game environments or formats. So for example, if you've ever had a professor try to gamify a class, then you'll hear things like, our grading system for this class is a bunch of points. And just like in the old Mario games, see, I'm old and I came up with the original 8-bit Mario Brothers, before there was a Super. Wow. Anyway, just like in Mario, your score for this class cannot go down. So you're just accumulating points throughout the semester, and your grade is, at 800 points, that's a B. At 1,000 points, that's an A. So you're free to experiment in this class. You're just piling up points, stacking up points, and we'll see how far you get by the end of the semester. Good luck. There are 1,200 points available in this class. So if you make it to 1,000 before finals week, you don't have to worry about the final, that last 200 points, or whatever. Okay? So that's using a game element, points, or score, which is an arbitrary, typically number, associated with progress or achievement or conflict resolution in the game. But, your university classes are not a game. It's just gamified in that sense. Now, as it turns out, grading is that, right? So it's just purely a philosophical or descriptive difference to have the inability to lose points versus losing points that were possible on a test, if you think about it. Mathematically, they are literally the same thing. But if we frame it in terms of, okay, now this is a competition with yourself to get across the finish line at 1,000 points as easily, as efficiently, or as quickly as you can, right? And so some people sort of key in on that. A lot of us are naturally a little bit competitive. You ever find yourself like playing a little competition with yourself? Kids make up little personal competitions all the time. Like, can I walk down the sidewalk without stepping on any cracks? Right? That's gamified walking. Okay? And it might be a full-on game based on all of the other things that make a game. And it might not. It might just be gamified. Okay? So, if you want to add a little bit more interactivity, if you want to inject a little bit of fun into something that isn't otherwise automatically fun for folks, think about gamification. Okay? And researchers like Jane McGonigal are pretty awesome at explaining a whole lot more about gamification for non-game settings if you're very curious about this, especially if you're going into teaching. Games, on the other hand, we have some specific things that we need for it to have or be or do before we can call it a proper game. Okay? So, now it's a longer discussion. Let's save that for another day where we can give it the whole day. Okay? Cool. So, any other thoughts or ideas on interesting things you guys want to maybe prototype out for any of your thematic points? All right. If you come up with any other ideas as we're chatting today, this is a good day to capture more of those. But let's jump forward into the conclusion section. This is going to be a pretty short section, but it's also one of the most important. So, in the conclusion, we want to send a couple or emit a couple of very clear signals and reinforce the theme, the most important thing of all. So, typically the first thing we do is we outro from our last chunk, our last thematic point, call that point number N. You go from 1 to N, typically. And you can skip a few if you're in a hurry that day, or you can avoid one of your thematic points if it's raining on the trail that day and it's just not going to work out well, or rearrange the order of things if you need to, if it's not locked into a sequence, whatever. Right? So we have N thematic points, some number typically between 5 and 7 again. Then we'll transition into the conclusion. Alright, so we're out of the last thematic point into the conclusion. First thing we want to do is reformulate the theme. This is what the whole thing is about, right? But now, instead of introducing to folks for the first time this hot take, this provocation, this invitation, this perspective on something that is not just factually true, but really interesting and really important, at least in your view. Now you've had a bunch of pages in your Junior Ranger guidebook, a bunch of stops along your guided hike, a nice chat for the last hour around the campfire, whatever the format is. We want to make sure that we come back to this. So, you don't have to repeat the same sentence. That's fine. Maybe it's important that you don't, so that you're not repeating yourself. In other cases, repeating the theme statement word for word is a very nice coda. It's a nice way to remind folks, oh yeah, this is what we've been sort of hammering away after the last hour or two, whatever it is. The last 200 pages in a major book, or something like that. Because now folks can regard this theme statement in a new light. They have a bunch more perspectives on it. Each one of those thematic points looked at, explored, pulled apart so we can put it back together, some aspect, some face of your theme. So we want to be real clear about it. Hey, what we've been doing today is X, Y, Z. Or just restate it. Or reformulate it if you want to pose it in a slightly new way. Maybe with that new perspective that we've gained. Okay? In collaborative interpretation, where it's more that conversation style or more that workshop style instead of you sort of downloading content into people's brains through your mouth, it's okay and it's pretty important if the point of that workshop or conversation was to come to a new understanding of the theme or the content or the topic, whatever it is. If folks have changed your sense of it, then it's a huge mark of respect to them for you to say, so I started this conversation today with everybody, started this workshop, this exercise, whatever it is, thinking XYZ, the theme. But from what I'm hearing from you guys and gals, maybe it's a little bit more like modified theme or drastically altered theme, right? So interpretation is about stuff that is important enough to critically evaluate, even on the fly. So if somebody's blowing your mind with some knowledge bombs they're dropping, or some wisdom or insight into it, or their personal experience of it, which is very different than your perspective, then that's a real mark of success for you, the interpreter, to have your mind blown by the interpretation. Does that make sense? All right, so it's okay, and it's a really cool, interesting thing to have your mind not necessarily just changed arbitrarily. It's not about arguing or whatever, or logicking somebody into some conclusion. But it's about encountering the thing, coming to grips with it. And if we come away changed, that's a 100% success. That's the A+, that's the gold star, that is what we are going for. So when you get changed as the interpreter, even more, even better. Okay? Cool. Very cool. Once we restate, reformulate the theme, we can sometimes debrief. Now, my outdoor rec students are going to have a pretty clear idea on what the debrief is. maybe education students as well. But for the rest of us, the debrief is kind of a reflective set of questions. So, what did we learn today? Or what did you think about this? We talked about some pretty hard things today. Some things that are not pretty. Some things that might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable in some ways. And if not, that's okay too. But what did you think about it? Was there anything that surprised you? Anything that you disagreed with? That's valid. You know? So, those debrief kinds of questions or conversations, it's not a bad idea to check in with folks with these kind of at the end of each thematic point as well. But it can be more powerful after we've stepped out of the specifics of all of those individual thematic points. And now we're putting the whole thing back together again. See what people think in light of all of it, not just the specific chunk of a single thematic point. Okay? But this isn't appropriate for all. There's no debrief on a cave tour at Mammoth Cave, right? You got 120 people behind you. You've been walking around for 4 hours. People are tired. Their feet hurt. They really need to use the restroom. We're going to get folks out to the buses after exiting the airlock on the cave, typically, and then back to the visitor center, and they can find some relief. Okay? So, this is a plus minus on the debrief. Maybe it's appropriate and it's important, and maybe it's just not the right tool, right? All of these are just different tools to accomplish things. So, this activity, you leading it, has been, and this is for staffed Interp primarily, this has been an exercise for you. If you are physically exhausted by the end of a particular interpretive encounter, all right. You went out there, you played hard, you didn't leave anything on the table, and you're pretty well spent. It's important to help folks understand, okay, now our time together is over. Thank you so much. This was amazing. All right, so part of the breaking up with the participants is it's not you, it's me. I would love to keep geeking out on this, all day, all week, all month. But some of us have to get on to lunch or what have you. So the cafeteria for our national park is over that way, or the lodge is back there over your shoulder. Help folks get reoriented to sort of the wider world beyond and disconnect with the shared experience of your intern and reorient and plug back into their creature comforts and needs for the rest of their trip or visit that day or what have you. Okay? And then, after you say, all right, we're done, you're not really done. But it's important that they have that signal so they understand what's going on, right? You're being very clear in your communication. And then always hang around. The show's not over when it's over, at least for you, the professional. Very, very commonly, you did succeed with some of the people. Some folks, maybe they're just getting over COVID, they're kind of brain foggy, and they're just kind of hanging on. They're there, they made it through, and they need to go take a nap, right? That becomes more important the older you get, like in the 40s. And other folks, they're in the zone with you, and they're kind of sad that things are over, and they're super excited. Oh, they want to come up to you and tell you, oh man, you were talking about whatever it was in the third stop on our timeline, and my family comes from literally the spot and the story that you were talking about. That is part of our family history. And they want to tell you stuff, and they want to ask you things. And one of the most common questions that you get is, I want to be you when I grow up. How do I become a park ranger? So what they're asking really is, how do I become an interpretive ranger at such and such national park? But people understand you are under the guise of the flat hat and the green and grays. You're a park ranger, typically in the role of an interpreter. Environmental ed teachers are very commonly in this space as well. And sometimes, you'll connect with one or two students throughout the semester, and they'll say, man, you get to geek out on this stuff that is awesome, and you get paid for it. Like, how do I do that? Everybody else is just trying to figure out what they want to be when they grow up. And so you, out in front of people, doing the thing that you're passionate about and pretty good at after some practice, yeah, people are going to look up to you. So that's a mark of success in terms of your presentation of the content and your selection of the content in the first place, right? You avoided doing things that you don't care about because the passion, the excitement about it, that comes through. And the lack of passion or excitement comes through as well. I have a couple of, I don't like to show them anymore because it's not really an uplifting thing. I have a couple of short video clips of rangers who are totally phoning it in at different national parks. Like maybe they're just having a really bad day, which is fine, that's normal. But when you're coming to work to interact with folks and you're kind of glassy-eyed, or you're just a little bit rumpled, or you're just you're at about 40% on the energy level scale, everybody can kind of see that, and it's okay, right? Maybe you're coming down with a cold, and we're all human, and that's okay. Everybody has off days, and you can't hold yourself to the impossible standard of grand slam every time. You really can't. This is very important. And at the same time, right, you are there to engage with folks. So you want to use that self-prep time in the pregame to get yourself together, right? This is going to be a big lift over the next encounter with people for staffed interpretation. All right, cool. So with the question and answer session over, that's kind of an open-ended thing. Sometimes you'll get nobody, and it's like, did they like me at all? And sometimes you're going to get mobbed with a whole bunch of people, and, if you could afford it, if you could allow it, you'd be chatting with them for the next couple hours, right? I mean, people can get that excited about what you are bringing them to, legitimately. That's not at all unusual. But typically you have the next guided hike to roll into, or you are exhausted and you need to find a restroom, or whatever the next need is, right? So that Q&A session, you want to get to as many folks as you can, engage with them as well as you can. Be prepared to answer some questions with, man, I have never heard that question before. I have no idea. But that's a really good question. Instead of, oh, well, yeah, well, that's definitely a thing, and just sort of nodding and bullshitting some answer with them, right? It's a huge mark of respect to, be surprised. As a content area expert and leader in this experience, sometimes you'll get a question that you never really thought about it, like from somebody else's lived experience or perspective, and they encounter it, they think about it in a different way than you do, and it's a cool new take on things, or a hot take, or one that you just flat out disagree with, but it's where they're coming from, right? So the answer to questions that you don't know the answer to is, what's a good way to get in contact with you? I would love to dig a little bit more on that. I have no idea how to answer that question. That's a really good question. Wow, you stumped the ranger today. Awesome. Nice work. High five. Unless you're social distancing, then just like elbow five, or whatever, okay? So that is super, super important. And also a very, very important answer, if any of you are thinking about going to grad school and you get a question during your comprehensive exams or your final defense or what have you, and somebody asks you a question you don't know the answer to, never make up an answer. It's the same thing. Professors can smell bullshit because, we're content area experts in whatever the topic of the research is. So, in any of those cases, right, it's about respect. Engage with that. Like, that's a new excuse to geek out even harder in between presentations or during the prep of your next thing, and then email the person back. Not that anybody uses email anymore, except for old boomers like me, but, text them back or what have you. Write out nobody does this anymore either, a blog post about the answer to that person's question, and then forward them the link to that blog post. Man, you totally blew my mind with this. So I went on a deep dive in our National Forest archives here at the Visitor Center, and kind of sifted through 150 pages or 150 years worth of documents, and this is what I found. Check this out. This is really cool stuff. I scanned some of these for you. They're up on the website. Here's the URL. Rock and roll. Man, you can make some amazing connections with people, and they'll stay in touch with you, typically over years, because you're actually connecting with that person. Like, you don't have to be best friends or anything, right? It's a professional connection, but it can be a very, very cool one. Okay? All right. And so that's only like 4 or 5 things to accomplish in the conclusion, but all of them are really important, yeah? And they're pretty uniform throughout conclusions, right? So the content is whatever you want it to be, however you want it to be formatted, wherever you want to take it, whenever you want to go and do it. The conclusion, generally pretty lockstep. Now, the 5th and final thing that may or may not be included formally, but you generally want to include it at least informally, is program evaluation. So, you guys have all filled out course evaluations on professors? All right. At least in the forestry program, those actually go somewhere. Like, people read them, and I got mostly really good course evaluations last semester, and then one person was just pissed, and I got dragged, 1 out of 5 and a couple of pointed comments at the end. But those go somewhere. Like, I see those, and so does my boss, and so does my boss's boss, and we have to have a conversation about that one student. That's coming up here in a couple of weeks, and it's okay, right? Like, I disagree with some of those conclusions, but I also have to answer for them. So, program evaluation is a super, super important thing. This is what is our check against, our bulwark, our prevention of just kind of churning out the same thing over and over and getting bored with it and so on and so forth. So you want to collect a little bit of data on how you did. What could we improve for next time? Not as a scary or stressful or awful thing. It takes a little while to, grow the professionally thick skin to be able to read unfiltered comments from visitors. Some folks are just psychotic. No, this student was not psychotic. They had valid opinions. I'm not even insinuating that. But this program evaluation, it can be a formal thing, like with course evaluations with your professors, right? We used to do it as a Scantron. Now it's, I think, a web form. And it's, bubbling stuff from 1 to 5. How did Professor Park do on XYZ? On down the list. Next, ask a bunch of different things and run basic statistics. What's your average sort of approval rating from your participants about this particular experience? And is there any sort of commonality among the comments that folks are providing as suggestions for improvement? If 30 or 40% of the comments have to do with the difficulty of the hike, okay, that's fair. Maybe you are a gonzo hiker, but it's not fair to impose that gonzo hike on everybody who's maybe not quite as Hunter S. Thompson about it as you are. So, does that make sense? All right. Nobody likes getting graded. But every once in a while, you get a really thought-provoking bit of feedback like, oh, yeah, I never did think about that. Also, in formal contexts, like if you end up doing interpretation with the National Park Service and stuff like that, they have part of the staff is devoted to doing program evaluation. So they'll go on your hike and record little things like disfluencies, the number of ums and ahs and and like, essentially pause words that you say as your brain catches up with your mouth. Everybody does them. And I hate reading transcribed class lectures because, as it turns out, I say a lot of disfluencies, like most people. But professional speakers, we have perhaps an obligation to do that a little bit less than everybody else. So we'll talk about some techniques in this class to help avoid things like disfluencies. The first of which would be just taking a minute to reflect on, what do I usually say when my brain-mouth connection is out of buffer? Like, I'm still downloading things to say to my mouth. I say or what have you. And then we'll talk about some techniques about getting through that. But that's just one part of program evaluation, and it'll be a lot of stuff like that. What was your eye contact like? All those things we talked about with introductions. Did Interpreter Nash touch his face a whole bunch when he was talking and looked kind of nervous about stuff? Or maybe he was just really itchy that day, or what have you. Okay? So program evaluation, not a lot of people look forward to it, but every once in a while, again, you really do get that really interesting, thought-provoking chunk of feedback. It's like, oh yeah, okay, I can work on that. So, these are our 5 things, our 5 boxes to check. Low-key plus the intro to the conclusion, or the transition from the last thematic point. So you could call that 5.5 or the 6th item. But if we can check these 5 boxes, at least informally, on program evaluation, then that's a pretty good way to tie off the experience in the encounter. Everybody can leave satisfied that you did everything you could as the facilitator, or the author if it's non-staffed interpretation. Cool. So, what the conclusion looks like for non-staffed interpretation is still all of this stuff, but you just don't have the sense of personal connection with it, right? So, in this case, breaking up with the participants at the end of a series of exhibits in a visitor center, for example, you don't have to tell them, okay, this is over. It's just over. And hopefully the site design, we'll get into that detail a little bit later, the site design helps folks know where to go next. How many of you guys have been to an attraction at St. Louis Zoo, or definitely at Disney? Pretty much every ride at Disney where you exit through the what?
Gift shop.
Gift shop. Exit through the gift shop. That is such a thing. It's a meme. But that's done on purpose. And interpretive centers typically have gift shops. That's a kind of non-staffed interpretation, and people get to vote with their dollars instead of voting with their time on the hike about how to engage further with this stuff. This is what they can bring home instead of just the memory of experience. Memories of experiences fade, but they fade toward the rose-colored glasses. Memory consolidation is a wonderful thing. All right. So, with non-staffed interpretation, the debrief is typically more of an invitation that a few folks will take up, most will not, to think about these things further, or links to additional resources on our website. For example, we've got some maybe streaming videos of more stuff that we just don't have time or the apparatus or capability to engage with during the hike or museum visit or whatever the format is. Non-staffed interpretation is pretty straightforward in that way. So we always want to make sure that folks have a way to connect further. If they get to the end of the Junior Ranger Guidebook and that's it, then the signal to them, the tacit or unspoken or unwritten signal is, okay, you've reached the last page. That's all there is about this. There's nothing more to go on about your life. Be warm and well fed and healed. And that's kind of it. But of course, that's never the case. So you always want to give folks, where can you go from here? Where can you go from here? Now, in staffed forms of interpretation where it's station interp, like a skills demonstration, you're disassembling and reassembling the same musket over and over at Colonial Williamsburg, or something like that, and people are wandering by, that suggestion for more information can't really come from you because people are joining you in the middle of your thing, and sometimes leaving in the middle of your thing, sometimes in the middle of your sentence they just kind of wander off without making eye contact. That's fine. You got to rely on the overall site design, sort of the team approach. Are the other interpreters also, maybe if they're not doing station stuff, they're not locked to that, can they provide the links forward, the more resources, the where do I go from here sense of your topic area? Okay? Cool. So, no interpreter is an island. We got to rely on our team. Or if you're a solo operation with a smaller not-for-profit, like Green Earth Incorporated here in town does a little bit of environmental interpretation at their different hiking trails inside Carbondale green spaces that they run. They have to rely pretty heavily on pamphlets with links to more information on the Green Earth website and links to other civic organizations, public benefit corporations, C Corps, that provide useful and relevant to their Interp kinds of resources. Okay. Any questions about the conclusion section of your stuff? All right, we just talked for like half an hour about conclusions. Very rarely is the conclusion section of your work a half an hour part of the experience. It could be as short as 90 seconds. You can run through some of these things pretty fast if you have to, but it's important to check all of these boxes. Do all of these things, and then that sort of rolls into our post-interp stuff. So like the Q&A, we'd file under that as well. Cool? All right, let's take a quick break. It's 1:45, right about time for stretching your legs, getting some water, recollecting yourself, maybe some calisthenics to wake up a little bit.
So how do those performance reviews get? I always wondered about those because sometimes I lay into my professors if they really upset me throughout the semester, I guess. But
Sure.
like, I don't know, I never actually thought that I was like doing anything with that. I just thought they read that and were like, yeah, right, and then just continued on with their lives.
Hey, professors have feelings too. No. Full professors don't have feelings. I'm kidding. So tenure track assistant professors have typically 5 years to arrive, teach classes, graduate a couple of graduate students, bring in some research funding, execute some research projects, publish some papers, stuff like that. And in the forestry program, at least, at the end of that 5 years, if your teaching evaluations aren't at least better than the average for the program, they don't even look at the research money that you brought in or anything like that. You get fired. So they absolutely do go somewhere for assistant professors. For associate professors like me, so went through the tenure process. That was all great. Great. We still have an annual review meeting that's mandatory with the department head, the head of the school that the department is in, and then the dean of the college that contains those. And, at each of those meetings, we're pulling up that list and going through that PDF, and it is pages and pages long of the summary statistics for each of those evaluation questions, and then all of the free-form, open-ended feedback, the, insert comments here field of it. And, we have a conversation about it. So my syllabi are different now, based on some feedback I got several years ago. Just a little bit more detail on those and stuff like that. At the associate professor level, some programs across campus that are like down staff members or down faculty members and stuff like that. I'm aware of one guy who got absolutely awful reviews, and was still hired on as an associate professor after his tenure track evaluation because the program was literally going to have to shut down if they couldn't hang on to him. So he got a pass, and that's everybody's loss, honestly. Like, he's still a terrible teacher, but in my opinion. Full professors don't have to go through the annual meetings, so they still get course evaluations and stuff like that, but it's up to them what they do with those. So, there you go.
Yeah, I always try to be reasonable and like not let my emotions take over too much.
Sure.
So, like,
But-
sometimes I definitely probably
Well, yeah.
say some stuff that hits home a little bit, or is kind of like, yeah.
Was that what you talked about during summer camp? You
Getting dragged?
Yeah, you filled us in on something. I couldn't remember if it was like years ago that it happened or if it was like just then it happened and it was hitting home.
That was-
Summer camp.
Yeah, that was that spring. Because we get those evaluations midway through the first week of summer camp. So it was like it's hot and fresh out the kitchen.
You were telling us about it when we were in Moab, so it's like the end of the trip.
Yeah.
It's rough.
I was stewing on it the whole time.
Yeah.
No, some years I'm smart and I just don't even open them up until
After
in a summer
camp,
camp.
yeah.
It's very rare to get something like that. That kind of hurts a little bit. That's probably once every 5 or 6 years on average for me. I have no idea what it's like for anybody else, but
So do you have like a meeting in a couple of weeks or something?
yeah, just an annual review. Yeah.
You talk to them about that review?
No, that one's already done
Oh,
last year,
good.
but yeah. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's just like one of those things where like I knew I was sending it somewhere, but I just didn't know what got done with it. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole office on campus that it's their whole job to like get all of those from everybody, you know, assemble the reports for each professor and, you know, blast them out to the...
And also can like affect some people like in tenure.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, because I'm a classics minor, and Dr. Allen was the advisor for that in one of his classes. He's tenured already. I guess he just got it. But whenever he gave us the evaluations, he was like, be honest. You know, like you get like genuinely like in all of your evaluations, be honest, because like for some of these people, once they're tenured, it's not going to matter. But like the way you get people who aren't like good at teaching to not be tenured and just be stuck here is these evaluations.
Yep, you got it. Which is real. I mean, you guys and gals are paying real money to be here, and there's a fair transaction expected. Like, you're taking these classes to acquire skills, to get credentials, formally or informally, and if you're not getting those things from a particular professor, like, the university needs to know about that. Our teaching evaluations, now that you mention it, are also a part of how we are accredited as programs. So, for example, here in forestry, every, I think it's 10 years, the Society of American Foresters brings in a whole bunch of PhDs from all over the country. It's a panel of several. And they take a look at everything we have done in the last 10 years, making sure that we are checking every box for being an SAF accredited program. We can't put that stamp on unless, you know, we're doing research and publishing and developing and sending out successful grad students and also teaching classes successfully. And one of the primary criteria for those class evaluations for reaccreditation are those feedback forms. They don't read through every single form of the last 10 years. They're looking at aggregate of the summary statistics across the whole faculty for the program. But like if somebody really isn't pulling their weight, you know, SAF sees that. So at least in forestry, I feel like at least most all the professors are, you know, we're here to teach as well as do good research. So it's not that way across all programs, but yeah, those really do go somewhere for sure. All right, so that doesn't have anything to do with interpretation, but the idea of program evaluation sure does. So we'll get into more detail on that talk about some good techniques for collecting that info, for not biasing that information positively or negatively, and making it fair and safe for the people to provide feedback anonymously so that you can essentially trust the responses more. There's a whole bunch of kind of science behind all that stuff, but boil it down into a list of best practices for you kind of towards the end of the semester is when we tackle that. All right, any other questions about conclusions sections? It's a great question about program eval. Cool. All right. So, one last note about your conclusion versus your content. If, and this is very normal, if you get a little bit off track on the time allotted for any of our practice run-throughs of a guided hike you want to put together, or whatever the format is, if you start running out of time, cut some of the content. Just walk right past one of your planned thematic points. Don't cut time from the conclusion, because every one of these is really, really, really important, like inescapably important. Every one of your thematic points is, of course, really, really, really important as well. Otherwise, you wouldn't have put it in there. But the whole reason that we developed 5, 7, a dozen different thematic points and kind of have them all mentally in our heads is so that we can change things on the fly. Just to keep it interesting for you, keep it fresh each time, so that you're not doing the same thing with the same words lockstep for the rest of your life. That'd be horrible. That would be horrible. This also gives you the flexibility, and that's where the flexibility needs to be built in on time, okay? So we'll learn to kind of self-assess pacing as we go. We'll learn to get comfortable with just completely abandoning for that particular run, that particular draft or practice run of your Interp trial, to just kind of let it go, okay? Really important last note on the conclusion and the post-Interp sections. Sound good? All right. From here, let's pull out your outlines and make sure that you've got these points under the conclusion. So the conclusion is going to be the restate the theme, plus or minus the debrief, if that's appropriate. And then the conclusion is over at breaking up with participants. That's the end of the formal and structured content. You're good. You survived. Nice work. The post-Interp stuff, which is not specifically about your planned content, but might be content like in the Q&A section. The Q&A and the program eval, those are the post thing. And then every once in a while, sort of outside of this outline, we have the opportunity to take a step back and be like, you know what? This thematic point that I had planned, usually I do it around third, it's just not carrying its weight. It's spending more time than I'm getting benefit out of it with my participants. So let me just cut that one out. And that leaves me a little bit short for being able to potentially abandon any of the others on the fly as I go. So let me plan 1 or 2 new thematic points that I've always wanted to be able to try with this. This is my opportunity. So after your first week of interpreting, after your first month, after your first semester or season of interpreting professionally, you go back to your planned outline and just kind of see where the weeds have started growing up in it, so to speak. Seeing where you could, now that you have a little bit more experience and some seasoning and some professional sense of what works and what doesn't, what could I add to my outline of thematic points and so forth? Or how could I tighten up that theme statement just to be a little bit more accessible to a wider audience? It's already provocative, it's already rolled right into a great hook and so forth, but it's not really reaching everybody. How do I get that last 10% a little bit better, right? So we go back outside of the framework of our outline to improve the outline as a normal consequence of things. And after a while, it takes a season maybe, so that might be several hundred guided hikes over the course of 3 months. like 4 times a day, 4 times a week. You've got some good feedback in your program evaluation in the post-interp section and can start incorporating some of that stuff. Cool. For most of us, that's a really satisfying thing. To kind of go back to something that you put together in the first place because you're passionate about it, and go back and like pop open the hood and tinker with it some more. Oh, that's a blast. That should never end. Okay? So I'm giving you permission to actually enjoy these assignments because they're about things that you're interested in. All right? That's one of the really important core messages of this class. Cool. All right, so stepping back from conclusion and post-interp phases. Got your outlines here? Okay. Let's spend the rest of class today just kind of knocking around some ideas for more thematic points. We spent the last tiny little chunk of class just starting to ideate on what are each of my thematic points? What kind of stuff could I do along a hike, or each page of a Junior Ranger guidebook, each one an activity, or a game, or something like that. And let's do some interaction with it. So, take a little time. Got about 15 minutes left of class. Jot down some more ideas. And again, with our ideating phase of this work, write down all of the ideas, even ones you think are half-baked.
Just like big, like just overarching thematic points that you could then
Yeah.
throw in and dissect.
Yeah, so if each thematic point is wrapped around one particular perspective or aspect or feature or event underneath your topic, you could call each one of them sort of a subtopic. So what's one good subtopic, or what's one good perspective, or one good event on that timeline or sequence that I should definitely at least think about including and have available to include, whether or not I actually have time to, or the energy to, or the right, mix of participants and their physical capacity or their learning level or whatever, just so that it's available to you. Say again?
Yeah, that's, I had an exam today that I didn't know I had, and it's just a bunch of essay questions.
It depends on me.
Sad.
Nice.
I gotta go buy some.
All right, so let's say your general topic is rock climbing.
This is so much
Subtopics under that might be things like sport climbing, or bouldering, or trad climbing. 3 different kind of modes or flavors or styles of climbing. Maybe one subtopic could be climbing adjacent stuff that, you as a sport climbing nut don't really think of as climbing. Like, it's not. It's filthy casuals and folks who call themselves climbers, but they're not really, to those of us who know. Topics like canyoneering, or subtopics like canyoneering. It's climbing adjacent, and to the uninitiated, might be mistaken for rock climbing, but it's a slightly different thing. You could talk about that as one of your subtopics. So by talking about something that your topic or your perspective on that topic isn't, folks can get a slightly clearer picture of what your perspective or your actual topic is. We're defining the space around it as well as the space of it. Okay? So think around your topic as well as within it. So we're coming up with different thematic points. points that are concerned with what is inside of your topic. So subtopics of content instead of defining what's around it. What are some individual people attached to a certain aspect of it? What are some events in the sequence, of course? What are some key places associated with it? So it's African American History Month. There's a whole bunch of historic interpretation and historic looking events all throughout February. A lot of cool stuff, right? Our first Monday of the first week of classes was Martin Luther King Day. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's all pretty cool. And it makes sense. You could have events around Selma, or the March on Washington, D.C., or Martin Luther King, or any of the other folks involved with the Civil Rights Movement, or earlier in the history, or modern day. So the list of thematic points that you could possibly do can easily grow very, very long. And so your interest, your curiosity, those are going to be key in helping you calibrate this particular personality or story or event or place is good, but it's not right for this chunk of Interp. Keep that on the list at this phase. We're just ideating. Okay? We'll do the sorting out, kind of the grading of different potential subtopics a little bit later, like we did last time. The themes, topics. If there's a particular part of your topic that you enjoy doing, put that on the list. Absolutely put that on the list. If there is something that is difficult for you about this topic, in terms of performing a specific skill or something like that, put that on, right? This is a great excuse to not only do the thing that you are enjoying learning about or talking about or encountering, but also to sharpen your skills on it. So with kayaking, maybe the self-fixing roll when you're upside down and you do like the hip twist. I've never gotten that quite right. But if I was doing Interp on kayaking specifically, I would absolutely put that on the list. What a great excuse to figure out how to not drown if I know I'm going to be doing it in front of a whole bunch of people. All right, so we got about 5 minutes so far. What kinds of notes to yourself do you have on subtopics or thematic points around those subtopics? What's on your list, anybody?
We've got fire building.
Fire building as
Creation.
okay. Is that your overall topic or?
Yeah, that's
All right.
my overarching topic.
All right. So what are some of the thematic points you might
Subtopics
do along the way?
Would be like fire designs or like fire constructions, if that makes sense. I don't know
Okay.
the term for it, but like the teepee or the log cabin.
Sure.
Or you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
And then uses of natural fuels could be another. How to start a fire. Obviously.
How to start a fire seems pretty important for a talk about starting fires. Cool. All right. All of those make sense pretty well, right? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff that we can talk about with campfires. Is really a specific realm within fire making. We can talk about how There's like 1 billion people around the world that are still cooking and sterilizing their water over cook fires. And typically, those folks are dying a lot younger because you got to spend a big chunk of your day tending that home fire, as the expression goes, and you're breathing in particulate smoke and the sulfuric acid aerosol particles that are in wood smoke, and so on and so forth. So, there's a bunch of stuff that's like straightforward, and you can bring in all sorts of human interest aspects around it that maybe some of your participants, if they're coming to learn about fire making, maybe it might be cool to introduce them to the much wider context around it. When and where in human development, in the last 300,000 years, do evolutionary anthropologists and archaeologists think that we first started using fire as a species? I'm not asking for answers to the question. I'm using that hypothetical to suggest another subtopic. Okay? We could talk about the symbolism of fire and campfire scale fires in particular relative to a whole bunch of different early cultures. It shows up in creation stories for almost every culture out there. And it makes sense that it would, right? So that's a way to, by zooming in and zooming out the scale or the scope of any of these subtopic ideas, we can hook a really cool skills demonstration into literally human history and all across the world and every major surviving culture and so forth. Okay? So, we want folks to understand not just the content, the facts, the story, the history, whatever it is you're interpreting, but remember, your theme expresses some sense of connection, value, or wisdom. Wisdom is more than knowledge. It's the value of that knowledge and how to apply it and when to apply it and when not to, and so forth. Okay? So, we don't want to lose sight of what we're really after here. The factoids of the content, we got to start there. But we are in no means staying there. We are moving beyond the factoids to what's the value of this? What's the meaning of this? How does this relate to you? How does this relate to me? How does it relate to you over there? How does this connect all of us together on some level? You might have a different skin tone than me. You might vote differently than me. You might have a completely different life experience than me. But we all have benefited from fire's ability to make our food safe to eat and delicious. Okay? So that's kind of where we want to go with these, or where we want to eventually get to with these. We want to start, of course, with the skill making, the different structures of fire, and so forth. All right? Somebody else. What kind of subtopics are you thinking about so far? Anything interesting? It's going to be fun this semester? Yeah.
So I'm in the forestry club, and like, is their education person, every time we do skills demos, they're just like, Evan's going to be the one talking. So I kind of wanted to like think of a way to like make it more interactive and less of them just like watching us pull a saw back and forth, you know. So like all my main thematic points are like the different events, so crosscut, axe throw, pulp toss, chain throw. But then the sub points would be like, so like I had found like a 30-page document on the history of crosscut saws, telling me all the different like types of tooths or the types of like teeth on a saw. So that's something. What wood they're better in, what's the difference between technique and single and double buck. For like chain throw, what is a chain? Why is it called a chain? It doesn't look like one. Talking about like anything but the metric system, you know, like you guys just make up measurements to represent arbitrary numbers and why. For like pulp toss, why is a smaller log called a pulp? Why is a can called a can? Stuff like that. Tools, we use a lot of tools people don't recognize, like the PV hook or a draw knife,
Mhm.
chain, for example. So
Yeah.
It's like explaining the history, how they came to be, stuff like that.
Okay, cool. Very cool. And just like with fire making, just like with every one of these, we want to be thinking about these topical points. And I say that they're topical points because you can probably do those in any order versus a more sequential thing. We want to think about answering the question or moving toward the question of this is the clear and straightforward content. Why do people care? That's the question we're trying to answer to our participants. Beyond the how to do XYZ, right? If this were just a bunch of training videos on making a fire, on rock climbing, on paddling, on whatever. Like, have you guys ever watched training videos? They're horrible. They're boring, right? It's like, I get it, wear a hard hat. Okay. And so forth. Like, I'm probably never going to have to actually drive this forklift, so why am I spending my life watching this training video for OSHA compliance? Anyway, professors have to go through so much training and compliance every year, and it's the same stuff. It's awful. Anyway, so the difference here, because we're doing some training, the difference here is that we are moving towards, we're using the training, the skill demonstrations, all of this stuff as a vehicle to get to why do we care? What's the connection? What's the value? What's the meaning? What's the wisdom of this? Okay, so when you're talking about different saw blade bits, for example, that's an excuse to talk about the course of human history. Once again, like with fire. So for example, metallurgy has a lot to do with the kinds of bitting that you can put on a saw or grind onto a saw and have any hope of it staying and or being effective, right? So there's a reason we don't use titanium in saws. Titanium is about the worst metal you could use for like a Jack and Jill saw because it's too light. And you're using the weight of the metal, the steel, to do the cutting for you. You're not pressing down on those teeth. That's a bad move. And we want to pick stuff apart like that. So different cultures, for example, have more or less and worse or better quality access to ores. The Japanese, for example, have very limited access to iron ore on the Japanese island chain, and so their castles and structures didn't use things like nails until very recently. If you think of like traditional samurai armor, it's all wooden lacquer, right? And the what was the Hanzo Hattori, like the katana from Kill Bill, or as made from Nippon steel, folded 1,000 times, whatever. It was folded 1,000 times because it was shitty quality iron or metal for making blades, and it's just super brittle. So that's one way to accomplish cutting, and so they didn't adopt straight bladed weapons like Western Europe martial designs did, because the metal was completely different. So you can get into details like that throughout history and connect the human experience to it, right? You can make a joke about Tom Cruise being, like the white savior of whatever in The Last Samurai, and so on and so forth. And you just started talking about crosscut saws, but we connect it to the human experience. So for anybody in our group today that has been doing stuff like sawing before, and if you've ever sweated out your clothes doing it, let's talk about some specifics on how you can spend a lot less sweat working smart instead of hard. Okay? That helps to connect with the why. Awesome. We're over time. I gotta finish. See you later. I'm around for questions. Question and answer? Yeah? And keep in mind how class is going. We'll get to that course evaluation a little bit later. Thanks, guys. See ya on Monday. No homework for today.
We're going to the